In the late 13th century, Scotland stood on the edge of chaos. When King Alexander III died in 1286, and his only heir, a little girl known as the Maid of Norway, followed just a few years later, the kingdom was left without a clear successor. For a proud but divided nation, this was a disaster, and England's ruthless king, Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, saw his chance. Pretending to play the role of peacemaker, Edward forced Scotland to accept a puppet king, John Balliol. But the Scots were not a people who would bow quietly. Out of the shadows rose a man whose name still echoes through history, William Wallace. Fierce, unyielding, and merciless to his enemies, Wallace led a rebellion that shocked the English. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, his outnumbered forces crushed the mighty English army in one of the most stunning upsets of the Middle Ages. For a moment, freedom seemed possible, yet England struck back with overwhelming force. Wallace was hunted, betrayed, and brutally executed. The dream of independence should have died with him, but it didn't, because another figure was waiting. In 1306, Robert the Bruce, a noble torn between loyalty and ambition, made his choice. Crowned King of Scots, he did not march with grand armies or glittering knights. Instead, he fought like a ghost, burning castles, striking from the hills, vanishing before England could answer. And it was this brutal, desperate guerrilla war that would set the stage for the battle that changed Scotland forever, Bannockburn. After the death of William Wallace, many thought the dream of Scottish independence had died with him, but Robert the Bruce refused to let it go. By 1306, Bruce had seized the crown of Scotland, yet his kingdom was little more than a dream on parchment. England's armies were everywhere its cast. Bruce understood something few medieval kings dared to admit. He could not hold Scotland by force alone. Instead of defending every stone fortress, he adopted a ruthless strategy. If a castle could not be held, it would be destroyed. Better to see its walls crumble than watch them fall into English hands. This was not a war of chivalry. It was a war of survival. Slowly, brutally, Bruce clawed his country back. His men struck from forests and bogs, ambushing patrols, starving out garrisons, and vanishing into the mist. Piece by piece, the English grip weakened. By 1313, only a handful of strongholds remained. Among them was the prize of them all, Stirling Castle. That year, Bruce's brother agreed to a daring gamble. If the English could not relieve the garrison by midsummer of 1314, the castle would surrender to Scotland. It was a bold challenge, one that forced Edward II, the King of England, into a corner. He could not ignore it. To lose Stirling was to lose the gateway to the north, and Perha. So Edward gathered the largest army England had ever sent into Scotland. Thousands of knights, archers, and infantry, determined to crush Bruce once and for all. What neither king fully realized was that this deal, this desperate gamble, had set the stage for one of the most legendary showdowns in medieval history, Bannockburn. The summer of 1314 was heavy with tension. Edward II marched north with an army unlike anything Scotland had ever faced, between 15 and 20,000 men. Glittering columns of armored knights stretched across the horizon, banners snapping in the wind, the thunder of hooves shaking the earth. To Edward, it was not simply a campaign. It was a chance to crush Robert the Bruce and erase the idea of an independent Scotland forever. Bruce, by contrast, commanded barely 6,000. Farmers turned fighters, hardened guerrillas, and a corps of veteran warriors who had bled with him for years. They were outnumbered nearly 3-1, and they knew it. But Bruce also knew something Edward did not. Battles are not won by numbers alone. The Scots chose their ground with care. Near the Bannockburn, a stream cutting through boggy terrain, Bruce positioned his army where cavalry, the pride of England, would be useless. The land was narrow, marshy, hemmed in by woods. Heavy horse would find no room to maneuver, no clear path to charge. Here, discipline and determination might outweigh armor and sheer mass. And Bruce had one more weapon, the schiltron. These were tight, bristling formations of spearmen, like living fortresses braced against cavalry. Time and again, English knights had smashed themselves on these walls of pikes, only to be driven back in chaos. At Bannockburn, Bruce intended to make the schiltron his shield and his sword. As the English host advanced, the Scots tightened their ranks, their spears angled like a deadly forest. For them, this was more than a battle. It was a fight for their homes, their families, their freedom, and against the greatest odds, they were ready to stand. The night before the battle was thick with tension. On June 22, 1314, the two armies encamped on opposite sides of the Bannockburn, close enough to hear each other's movements, close enough for fear to gnaw at every heart. In the English camp, torches burned bright against the summer sky. Edward II's men numbered nearly 20,000, a sea of tents and armor glinting in the firelight. Knights boasted of the coming slaughter, confident in their king's overwhelming strength. The air was filled with the snorting of war horses, the clatter of steel, and the coarse laughter of soldiers who believed the next day would bring an easy victory. Across the stream, the Scottish camp was smaller, quieter, but no less intense. Robert the Bruce walked among his men, speaking to them not as a distant monarch, but as a comrade. Many of these men were farmers and shepherds, poorly armored, their weapons little more than spears and axes. Yet each one of them knew what was at stake, not just survival, but the very soul of Scotland. As dawn broke on June 23rd, Edward's vanguard began to probe the Scottish positions. Among them was a young, headstrong knight named Sir Henry de Bohun, eager to carve glory for himself. He spotted Bruce riding ahead of his lines on a small palfrey, an ordinary horse, not a great war steed. To Bohun, it was an irresistible chance. Lowering his lance, he spurred forward at full speed. The ground shook as his armored charger thundered toward the Scottish king. All eyes turned. To the English, it seemed Bruce was doomed, alone, lightly armed, with no time to flee. But Bruce did not move. Calm, steady. He waited until the last possible second. Then, in one fluid motion, he turned his horse aside and swung his battle axe with terrifying precision. The blade crashed down upon Bohun's helmet, splitting steel and skull in a single, brutal strike. The young knight fell lifeless to the ground. His charge ended in an instant. A stunned silence rippled across the battlefield. Then, from the Scottish lines, came a roar, wild, deafening, a cry that seemed to shake the earth itself. Their king had faced an English knight in single combat and triumphed with one blow. The impact was electric. To the Scots, it was a sign that God was with them. Courage surged through their ranks, turning fear into fury. To the English, it was a grim omen. If even their armored knights could be felled so swiftly, what hope lay in sheer numbers? Bruce himself, ever practical, scolded his men for cheering. He regretted risking so much for a single duel. But the effect could not be undone. In that moment, the balance of morale shifted. A spark had been lit, and the Scots entered battle with fire in their hearts. That day's clashes ended inconclusively, but the psychological victory was already Scotland's. The English had been shaken, the Scots emboldened. The stage was set for June 24th, when two armies would collide in full fury at Bannockburn. What had begun as a reckless charge by one knight had transformed into a legend, a moment that still defines Scottish pride centuries later. The first day of battle dawned with the English still confident in their sheer numbers. Edward II's army stretched across the fields in an ocean of steel, knights on massive war horses, foot soldiers bristling with spears, archers ready to darken the sky with arrows. Against them stood barely 6,000 Scots, drawn up tightly in schiltrons, bristling hedgehogs of long pikes, disciplined, immovable. At midday, the English cavalry, proud and arrogant, surged forward. The thunder of hooves rolled like thunder across the plain, a sound meant to terrify and scatter lesser foes. To the English, the outcome seemed inevitable. No peasant militia could withstand the crushing weight of armored knights. But Robert the Bruce had prepared for this very moment. He had studied the ground, chosen it with care. The Bannockburn itself, a shallow but treacherous stream, cut through the battlefield, its banks marshy, soft, and uneven. Behind the Scots lay narrow ground, wooded and tight, perfect for defense. The English had space to maneuver, but not where it mattered. When the first waves of cavalry smashed into the Scottish lines, something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking, the schiltrons held. Hundreds of spears thrust outward in every direction, forming an impenetrable wall of steel. Horses reared back in panic. Impaled on sharpened pikes, knights were thrown from their saddles, crushed beneath their own animals. The momentum of the charge died in an instant, replaced by chaos. The English regrouped, furious. Another charge followed, and another, each one more desperate than the last. But each time the result was the same. The Scots stood firm, their formations locked, their discipline unshaken. The Schiltron was not merely a shield, it was a statement that these men would not yield their homeland, not to any king of England. Then came a disaster for Edward's men. Determined to outflank the Scots, one wing of the English army attempted to ford the Bannockburn itself. Heavy cavalry, weighed down by armor, plunged into the marshy ground. What should have been a swift maneuver turned into a nightmare. Horses sank up to their knees, struggling to find footing. The once proud knights floundered in the mud, easy targets for Scottish spearmen who waded in with ruthless precision. The stream became a trap, swallowing men and animals alike. Word of the disaster spread quickly through the English lines. The invincible aura of Edward's army began to crack. Soldiers whispered that the ground itself favored the Scots, that God had turned against England. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, the Scots raised triumphant cheers. For the first time in living memory, common men had stood against England's finest knights and bloodied them. As evening fell, the English withdrew, shaken and humiliated. Casualties littered the field, fallen horses, shattered lances, the bodies of knights who had once believed themselves untouchable. Their pride had been wounded as deeply as their flesh. In the Scottish camp, however, the mood was electric. Robert the Bruce's gamble had paid off. His men had not only survived the first onslaught, but proven themselves equal, no, superior, to the might of England. Around the campfires, songs and prayers rose into the night, voices filled with new confidence. These were no longer fearful peasants. They were warriors of a nation on the brink of freedom. For Edward II, the shock was profound. He had expected victory in a single day. His overwhelming force sweeping the Scots aside like chaff before the wind. Instead, his knights had been humbled, his army bloodied, his enemy emboldened. Tomorrow would bring the true test, but already the balance of power had shifted. June 23rd ended not with an English triumph, but with a sense of foreboding. The Scots had held the field, and more importantly, they had seized the initiative. Bannockburn was no longer a question of overwhelming numbers. It was now a battle of will, and the Scots were winning. At dawn, the battlefield was cloaked in mist. The English awoke, expecting to deliver the final blow. With numbers still vastly in their favor, confidence lingered, yet beneath the surface lay unease. Yesterday's humiliations had shaken the army, but Edward II believed sheer force would prevail. Across the field, the Scots gathered not in battle formation, but in prayer. Robert the Bruce led his men to their knees. 6,000 hardened warriors bowed their heads, spears planted in the earth, murmuring hymns. To the English, it seemed a sign of weakness. They begged for God's mercy before they die. Some sneered. But to the Scots, it was the opposite. It was a vow that they fought not for gold or conquest, but for their homes, their families, their freedom. The moment the prayers ended, Bruce ordered the advance. What happened next stunned the English. Instead of waiting defensively as before, the Scottish Schiltrons began to move. Tight formations bristling with pikes, surging forward like living walls of steel. Step by step, they pushed across the field, chanting, roaring, their momentum unstoppable. Edward's knights spurred forward, desperate to smash the Schiltrons as they had always done in past wars. But the ground betrayed them. The narrow, marshy terrain left no room for sweeping cavalry maneuvers. Horses slammed headlong into the pike walls, again and again, only to fall screaming under the relentless forest of spears. Knights were dragged down, trampled by their own mounts, cut off from rescue by the sheer density of the Scottish advance. Panic rippled through the English lines. The carefully drilled formations collapsed into chaos. Archers, packed too tightly, struggled to find room to shoot. Foot soldiers, seeing the mounted elite falter, lost faith and began to waver. And then came the final blow, the moment that turned the tide into rout. From the hillsides around the field, a mass of unarmed Scots, camp followers, cooks, smiths, and even children, suddenly rushed down toward the English rear. They carried no weapons of war, only sticks, axes, and whatever tools they could grab. But to the terrified English, it looked like fresh reinforcements, another army descending. Exhausted, bloodied, and surrounded, the illusion was enough. The cry went up, "We are outflanked. The Scots have more troops." Panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers who only moments before had stood in ranks now threw down their weapons and fled. The Bannockburn itself became a deadly trap, swollen with the weight of retreating men and horses. Knights drowned in the mud, crushed beneath their comrades. Robert the Bruce's army pressed relentlessly. Schiltrans drove deep into the heart of the English lines, scattering resistance. What had begun as an orderly army of 20,000 dissolved into a panicked mob, running for their lives. In the chaos, Edward II himself nearly fell into Scottish hands. Surrounded by the rout, his royal standard was almost captured. Accounts say his bodyguards dragged him from the field, forcing him onto a horse and racing south, abandoning everything. The King of England fled not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive. By midday, the field of Bannockburn belonged to Scotland. The English camp lay in ruins, supplies and treasure plundered. Thousands of English soldiers lay dead or captured. More than just men had been lost. An empire's aura of invincibility had been shattered. For the Scots, it was more than victory. It was vindication. A small, outnumbered army had faced the might of England and triumphed. Around the battered pikes of the Schiltrans, men embraced, laughed, and wept. They had not only survived, they had broken the chains of fear that bound their nation. The legend of Bannockburn was born that day, and for Edward II, the defeat would haunt him forever. His prestige crumbled, his nobles whispered of incompetence, his enemies smelled blood. He had marched north to crush rebellion, but instead, he returned south a king disgraced. Bannockburn was more than a battle. It was the day a nation proved itself. A day when prayer turned into steel, when peasants humbled knights, when the fate of Scotland shifted forever. When the dust settled on the blood-soaked fields of Bannockburn, the true scale of the English disaster began to unfold. What started as an ambitious campaign to crush the Scots ended in humiliation, so deep that it echoed through every castle and court in Christendom. The English losses were catastrophic. Thousands lay dead in the marshes and meadows around the Bannockburn. The flower of English chivalry, the proud knights and barons who had ridden north expecting easy triumph, were either slain or dragged into Scottish captivity. Entire noble families were struck down in a single day. Among the fallen were lords whose names carried weight across England, men who had served as pillars of the realm. Their deaths created not just grief, but political instability, as estates were left leaderless and heirs too young to govern. Worse still for Edward II, many of those not killed were captured, and in medieval warfare, captivity meant ransom. Robert the Bruce and his commanders suddenly found themselves in possession of some of the wealthiest nobles in England. For the Scots, this was more than military success. It was financial salvation. Ransoms poured gold into Bruce's coffers, fueling his war effort and strengthening his hold on the kingdom. Every English noble behind Scottish bars was another bargaining chip, another guarantee that England would think twice before marching north again. But the most immediate prize was Stirling Castle. The fortress had been the very reason the armies clashed. Now, with the English host shattered, its garrison had no choice. Surrounded, isolated, and hopeless, the defenders surrendered. The symbolic weight was enormous. Stirling, the great stronghold at the heart of Scotland, was once again in Scottish hands. The English ambition of securing Scotland's central belt had collapsed completely. For Robert the Bruce, the victory was more than strategic. It was personal vindication. Once dismissed as a rebel and an outlaw, he now stood as the undisputed king of Scots. No rival claimant could challenge his legitimacy, not after Bannockburn. The clans and nobles who had wavered before now rallied to his banner. Unity, so elusive in Scotland's turbulent history, began to take root. For the first time in generations, the nation could look to a single leader with both the will and the strength to defend its independence. The psychological impact was equally profound. Across Scotland, peasants and townsfolk alike celebrated not just the triumph of their king, but the triumph of their nation. Bannockburn proved that the Scots could defy the mightiest army in Europe and prevail. Songs were sung, stories told, legends born. In the minds of ordinary men and women, the victory was nothing short of divine justice, God's favor made visible on the battlefield. South of the border, the mood was the exact opposite. Edward II returned to England in disgrace, his crown tarnished by failure. He had led one of the largest armies ever assembled by an English king into Scotland, and fled the field like a beaten dog. Chronicles speak of mockery spreading among his own people. Nobles whispered behind his back, commoners laughed at his expense. He was branded not as a conqueror, but as the king who abandoned his men. The court seethed with resentment. Many of England's most powerful lords had lost fathers, brothers, or sons at Bannockburn, and they blamed Edward. His rash decisions, his refusal to heed advice, his reckless commitment to battle on unsuitable ground. All of it fed the growing sense that the king was unfit to rule. The seeds of rebellion, long buried, found fertile soil in the shadow of defeat. Internationally, the consequences were just as sharp. Across Europe, monarchs and princes took notice. The English, once feared as an unstoppable force, had been humbled by a smaller, poorer, but determined nation. The prestige of England declined, while Robert the Bruce's reputation soared. Envoys began to consider recognition of his kingship, and foreign courts treated Scotland with a new measure of respect. Most importantly, Bannockburn secured time. Time for Bruce to consolidate his authority. Time for Scotland to rebuild its shattered lands. And time to press the war into England itself. In the years that followed, Scottish raiding parties crossed the border, torching villages, extracting tribute, and reminding the English crown that Scotland would not bow. But at the heart of all these consequences was a simple, undeniable truth. Bannockburn had shifted the balance of power. For decades, England had sought to reduce Scotland to a vassal state. On June 24, 1314, that dream was drowned in blood. The Scots had proven themselves a people who would fight, endure, and sacrifice everything for independence. And Robert the Bruce, once a fugitive hiding in caves and remote isles, now stood as one of Europe's most formidable kings. His victory was not only military but moral, reshaping the destiny of a nation. For Edward II, humiliation was only beginning. In the years ahead, his authority would crumble further, his nobles would turn against him, and his reign would descend into disaster. But for Scotland, Bannockburn was a beacon, the moment when the tide turned, when hope became reality, when a nation stood tall. The echoes of Bannockburn did not fade when the last sword fell silent. What Robert the Bruce achieved on those June days in 1314 was more than a battlefield victory. It was a seismic shift in the way wars, nations, and legends were understood. For centuries, the armored knight on horseback had been considered the ultimate weapon of medieval Europe. They were the hammer of kings, trained from boyhood, clad in steel, riding war horses worth a fortune. Yet, at Bannockburn, that myth shattered. Ordinary men, farmers, craftsmen, townsfolk, organized into disciplined chiltrons, had stood shoulder to shoulder and brought those knights crashing down into mud and blood. It was proof that courage, unity, and strategy could topple even the mightiest war machine. This idea would ripple across Europe, inspiring infantry-centered tactics that slowly replaced the dominance of the mounted elite. But Bannockburn was not just a military turning point. For Scotland, it became the heart of a national story. 6 years later, in 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath was drafted, a letter to the Pope demanding recognition of Scotland's independence. In it, the Scots declared that they would never submit, that as long as 100 of them remained alive, they would fight for freedom. That fierce declaration was born out of Bannockburn, where they had proven to themselves and to the world that freedom was not a dream, but a reality carved by steel and sacrifice. Over time, Bannockburn transformed into legend. Poets and storytellers seized upon it. Centuries later, Robert Burns would write verses that invoked the spirit of Bruce and the battle, tying it forever to the Scottish soul. Folk songs, national commemorations, even modern political rallies have echoed with Bannockburn's cry that a small, determined people can defy an empire. The legacy stretched beyond Scotland. Across Europe, oppressed peoples looked to Bannockburn as proof that the seemingly impossible could be done. In every age, whenever a weaker nation stood against a stronger oppressor, the memory of Bannockburn whispered encouragement. Courage and unity can triumph over sheer might. For Scotland, Bannockburn was not just history. It was identity. The image of Robert the Bruce raising his axe against Sir Henry de Bohun, of farmers with pikes holding back thundering cavalry, of Edward II fleeing in humiliation, these became more than stories. They became symbols. Symbols of freedom, resilience, and the unbreakable will of a people who refused to be conquered. Even today, more than 7 centuries later, Bannockburn remains a touchstone. It lives in monuments, in annual remembrances, in the hearts of Scots who still see in it the eternal lesson that no matter the odds, the fight for liberty is always worth waging. At Bannockburn, Scotland did more than win a battle. It won a place in the imagination of the world, a place where courage stands taller than power, and freedom shines brighter than crowns.